Mugabe delivered his ultimatum as opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai left hospital still suffering from injuries inflicted while in police custody. Now, Tsvangirai says he was beaten by police during a rally on Sunday. The attack was so vicious he claims to have fainted 3 times. Left with a suspected skull fracture and badly bruised, international outcry over the attack has been widespread.
Well, this is not the first time people have gone through this experience. I'm not the only one who has gone through the experience. One thing is for certain, that freedom is not cheap. And that it's only when people lose their freedom that they realize how freedom is precious.
We'll get some expert analysis on the situation in Zimbabwe in a moment. But first, a quick look at Robert Mugabe's political career. In 1960, he joined the National Democratic Party, opposing white rule in what was then southern Rhodesia. He was jailed for 10 years for his political activities. Released in 1974, he united opposition factions and ousted the white minority government. The 1980 elections brought Mugabe to power as Prime Minister of what was now Zimbabwe. In 1987, the position of Prime Minister was abolished and Mugabe became President. But by 2002, Zimbabwe's economy was in tatters while political crackdowns intensified along with allegations of vote rigging and intimidation. Well, with me now is Dapo Oyewole from the Centre of African Policy and Peace Studies. Dapo, thank you for joining us. Do you think we're witnessing the beginning of the end of Robert Mugabe's reign?
Well, it's going to be a very long beginning of the end, because if there's anything that is very clear is that Mr. Mugabe is not going to let go of the reins of power until something happens. And what that thing that would happen is the key question. What will happen that would actually make Robert Mugabe let Zimbabwe go?
He said today that he believes that there are those within his own ZANU-PF party plotting against him. Does that make it almost an impossibility for him to become a candidate at the elections if they take place next year?
Well, he's already come out to say that he is interested in going for another term, which is, I mean, if you really look at it, he's been there for almost forever. But I think the key issue is that this reflects a great crisis of leadership and governance in Zimbabwe. And the kind of pictures we've seen begins to reflect the kind of disregard for human rights and the rule of law in Zimbabwe as well. What is really unfortunate, like you clearly illustrated, is that this is a man that used to be one of Africa's liberation heroes, and as we are celebrating Ghana's 50 years of independence, it's unfortunate that he's the one presiding over this theatre of violence.
Well, you talk about the rest of Africa. The communication between those other governments in Africa and Zimbabwe seem to be very quiet indeed. South Africa themselves claim they are in quiet diplomacy with Zimbabwe. What is the view of the situation now in the rest of Africa?
Well, the reality is that Zimbabwe has become a political embarrassment to all African leaders, particularly the African Union, that is trying to increase standards of good governance, transparency, accountability, and respect for human rights in Africa. But what we need to bear in mind is that Mugabe is not an easy opponent to tackle, so to speak. This is a highly respected individual. He gave shelter and support to a lot of the leaders in the Southern African region when they were fighting against white minority rule. So it is very difficult for them at this point in time to actually publicly embarrass or disgrace or reject what he is doing. But what is interesting now that we've seen is that more leaders are now coming out and saying this has got to stop.
What we have seen, though, is how this whole situation affects the ordinary people of Zimbabwe, the lack of basic essentials, bread, sugar, even petrol. But the bedrock of his support over the years has been the soldiers and the police, who are now being affected in the same manner as those ordinary people. Do you think that lack of support will eventually finish off Robert Mugabe?
Well, what you will always find in situations, and every country where you have a very strong dictator, is that irrespective of the kind of disagreement that people may have with his policies, the fear, the atmosphere of fear and intimidation stops anyone from actually coming out and actually standing against him. So there might be people within the ZANU-PF party and within the army or within the police forces that want to overthrow, that want to at least ensure he goes, but they will not come out at this point in time. But the African Union must act robustly, effectively, and immediately right now for the same reasons you mentioned, because of the people of Zimbabwe.
Dapo Oyewole, thank you.
Pleasure.
There have been violent protests outside Pakistan's Supreme Court in Islamabad, and several politicians, including an opposition leader, have been arrested. Crowds gathered at the court to protest the suspension of Pakistan's chief judge, who's accused of misconduct. Government critics say the charge is